Good afternoon and welcome to this fireside chat on India and the future of energy. The title is a little curious. I would have thought that it should be India's energy future, but whatever, I think let's leave it at that. But we have a fireside chat, by which I suppose what we mean is a discussion between the principals. I don't like to call them antagonists. They are discussants, right? So we have Mr. Tim Gould from the IEA, and presumably he will talk about the World Energy Outlook 2022, and especially the chapters which focus on India. And then we have Mr. Tarun Kapoor, who is energy advisor in the Prime Minister's office. So he knows all about the Indian energy scene, and presumably he'll be able to ask Tim Gould to, maybe clarify, his presentation, may be able to pose certain pertinent questions which relate to India's energy future. And correspondingly, I think Tim Gould might like to respond and ask some questions of Tarun Kapoor. So I think we'll give the floor first to Tim Gould. He has a presentation, I believe. So you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ghosh. It's a grand pleasure to represent the International Energy Agency at such an esteemed gathering. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Mr. Kapoor for agreeing to spend some of his valuable time talking about these big topics in front of us. And indeed, I am going to talk about the future of energy using our World Energy Outlook. There's plenty to talk about. This topic is almost unimaginably broad, but I'll try in a few minutes to give some perspectives on things that we think are particularly significant in the world of energy at the moment. And of course, one of the main ones is what we're calling the first global energy crisis, and that we've all suffered bruises from in different ways through high and volatile prices, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. There is a sense that some of those pressures are easing. If you look at the price markers, particularly for natural gas, in Europe, we're now down to only 2 or 3 times higher than where we were prior to the crisis, which for some people counts as a moment to declare the crisis over. We are much more watchful at the International Energy Agency. We believe that Europe and global energy markets are not yet out of the woods. There are significant uncertainties that remain, and we can get into those. I mean, if you look at gas markets, it's the case that there will be relatively little new liquefaction capacity coming on to the market in 2023, only around 20 or 25 BCM. And one of the huge uncertainties in gas markets is also, what does China's reopening then mean for that country's import requirement? Because were China to come back strongly, it could easily take not just that 20 BCM that's coming to the market, but some additional gas as well. And so there is, in our view, some potential for markets to tighten quite significantly again later in the year. But we will come back to that. And I would like to just start by underscoring why this conversation in India, in Delhi today is so important. This is some data from the scenarios that we produce at the International Energy Agency. And what's striking here is not just the fact that India is the largest source of global increase in energy demand to 2050. But look where China is. China is pretty much where it is today in 2050. The big sources of growth are India, Africa, Southeast Asia. And that's why it's so important that India, in its G20 presidency, put those issues front and center in the debate. we need to constantly have this kind of picture in mind when we think about the forces shaping the future of energy, and make those very strong links, as the Indian government has done, between energy and development, between access to energy and the prospect for bettering people's lives, and the policies such as the Ujjwala program that can help get people on that ladder of modern energy. There's another question, though, which again is front and center in the G20 discussions, and that's, given that rise in demand for energy services, are we on track to meet that in a sustainable way? And one of the striking numbers from our own tracking is that for 5 years after the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, the amount of money going into clean energy transitions, by which we don't just mean renewable power, but also improvements in efficiency and infrastructure and clean fuels, they were pretty flat. That is a long way from where we would need to be. Those numbers have started to pick up, and because of responses to the crisis, including those in India, but also notably the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and Repower EU in Brussels and so on, we believe that by 2030, we will not just be investing $1 trillion in clean energy transitions, but that number will be closer to 2 trillion. Now, there's two big caveats with that number. It's of course very encouraging, but there's two big caveats. One is that that would still not be enough to get us on track for a scenario that meets global climate goals, that avoids very severe impacts from climate change. So we would need to see not 2, but something closer to 4 if we were going to be on track for that. And the other big caveat is that most of the increase that we've seen so far has come from advanced economies and China. So it hasn't come from those economies that were on the left-hand side of the previous chart, the ones where we're going to see such a huge rise in demand for energy services. So for us, that is a big warning signal about the future. And again, one that we very much welcome the attention that is getting into this issue in a G20 context this year. I wanted to just address one other topic that arises whenever you discuss the global energy crisis, and that is, should we be thinking of the crisis as a setback for transitions, or should we be thinking of it as something that accelerates the pace of change? And one of the narratives that you will hear is that in the course of 2022, because of the crisis, a lot of countries kind of return to coal. I mean, you see that in Europe, you see that in some other parts of the world. But what I wanted to show here is that, yes, there's been an increase in coal burn in 2022, but it's comparable in size to the increase that we saw in solar and in wind. And that upward momentum for coal, in our view, is temporary and not very large, whereas the boost that is given to renewables as we move through the decade is lasting and much more substantial. And what that means is that when you map that onto the emissions from the global power sector, in our view, we are on the verge of quite a significant moment where you do get a peak in global CO2 emissions from electricity generation. Now, again, that's not enough to get us on track for the Paris Agreement, but it's nonetheless quite an important moment in energy history. And one of the other things that's changed for us when we look at the implications of the global energy crisis is around the outlook for natural gas. That's where the trajectory has been in the last 10 years. But in our view, that really flattens out over the period to 2050 in a world that's governed by today's policy settings. There's different dynamics in different parts of the world, but that's quite a different outlook for gas than the one that we had previously. That doesn't mean necessarily that the importance of LNG goes down, because we've seen, in our view, a lasting reduction in pipeline deliveries from Russia to the European Union, and LNG needs to fill that gap. So you see much stronger growth in LNG, but I think there's some important market dynamics here that are relevant for the discussion around the future of gases in India's energy mix as well. And if we put that trajectory for gas together with what we see for coal, which is a structural decline, and then a flattening of oil demand as we move into the 2030s because of electric mobility and so on, we see another very significant moment in global energy history. And that's the moment where, in aggregate, we start to use less fossil fuels. You look back 200 years, every decade we have used more fossil fuels than the last. And every decade, the emissions from the combustion of those fuels has risen. And what we are now seeing in a world governed by the policies that are in place or announced today, that we could be approaching a moment already this decade where we see a peak fossil fuel demand. And it will then be other forms of energy, notably, of course, clean energy technologies and efficient technologies that will accompany the global economy on its upward journey. Now, again, the dynamics there are different depending on which part of the global energy system you're looking at. And India, of course, has such strong growth that it sees quite different dynamics from the global picture. But again, quite a significant moment in global energy history. And a final remark from my side would be around how do we maintain energy security in a rapidly changing system? Because if we accept the premise of the previous slide, that we are going to soon move into a world where global fossil fuel demand in aggregate is falling, then we are in perhaps a multi-decadal moment where we will have the sort of coexistence of two systems. We will have the legacy system of traditional fuels, and we will have an expanding sort of clean energy system with all sorts of interactions between those systems along the way. And I think the important thing to have in mind from an energy security perspective is that the good functioning of the entire system depends on both of those elements continuing to function well. And that is that has all sorts of interesting implications then for policymakers. One is the sequencing of the changes that you make, which also on the investment side. Because at the moment, for every dollar that goes into fossil fuels, we're spending about $1.50 on clean energy technologies. And the way that those ratios move in future are mutually dependent. In a sense, the quicker that we scale up the clean, the less we will need on the fossil side. And so if we talk about a 1.5 degree stabilization, that shift has to be very dramatic, so that already by 2030, for every $1, well, for that ratio becomes 9 to 1. So every dollar going into fossil fuels, and we will still need some, we would need to be spending 9 on different elements of clean energy supply and efficiency. Another element that is very important from an investment perspective is how do we bring additional capital into emerging and developing economies? Because particularly a time when borrowing costs are rising, that is not an easy thing to do necessarily, particularly when the cost of capital for all sorts of projects, including clean energy projects, in our view, is 2 or 3 times higher in many emerging economies than it is in advanced economies or in China. And there are some new energy security vulnerabilities that we need to be very watchful of, and I'm sure we'll come back to these, around the location of clean energy manufacturing, but also the critical mineral supply that we will need for our clean energy technologies. Because at the moment, the geographical concentration of manufacturing and supply of those clean energy technologies, but also the critical minerals that go into them, is much more concentrated than it is for in the case of oil and gas. So there are some framing elements from my side from the World Energy Outlook, and I look forward very much to getting into the implications and teasing out some of the complications and opportunities that emerge as a result for India with the help of our esteemed guest today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. Will we make a presentation on the Indian situation?
So my sense was suitably humble that I would look to our esteemed guest to comment on more on the Indian situation, and perhaps, if you agree, I mean, we could start with the immediate global energy crisis, because as I mentioned up front, we've all sustained bruises of different kinds as a result of this, and I'm particularly curious to your assessment about how India has managed to weather the storm.
So thank you very much. Lovely presentation, very informative. The energy crisis which hit the world because of the high price of gas going to $60 from something like $6 10 times, and even crude going to $130 and all. So we as a country are probably one of the largest importers. 85% of our crude is imported, and then not only crude, even on product, about 50% of the LPG which we consume, and LPG is so basic to us cooking, we can't do without that. So that product is also imported. And then on natural gas, again, a little more than 50% we import. So we were very badly hit. But then we tried to ensure that the consumer is not affected. And though the price of petrol and diesel did go up, but then government reduced taxes. Some state governments also reduced VAT, but then at least excise government reduced. And then a big hit was taken by the oil marketing companies. So oil marketing companies went into huge losses. Total losses which have accumulated with the oil marketing companies is those figures are really big, running into thousands of crore rupees. And then government did come up with some support, financial support also for these oil marketing companies. There were some subsidies which could be given to them for LPG, which earlier government had said that we will not give. But then government said, okay, now you're going broke, so we will. So some money did come from the budget also. So a combination of reducing taxes and then oil marketing companies themselves taking a big hit. That was their own decision. And also government giving a little money, those subsidies, or because LPG price is controlled by the government. So then the oil marketing company said that if you want us to maintain this price, and this price is controlled by you, so you better fill that gap. So that little bit of money did come from the government. So over that period, then we managed to keep the price stable. Now the whole country has got used to a very stable price. So oil marketing companies are not increasing or reducing the price, though currently, if we look at the current crude price and the international product price, then probably we could again reduce the petrol price by, say, 1 or 2 rupees, and increase the diesel price again by 1 or 2 rupees. So it's come to almost the same. On natural gas, the story has been a little bit more difficult, because petrol and diesel mostly go towards transport. Natural gas, a large percentage goes into fertilizer, and fertilizer is something which we can't do without. So that was the only area where we had to buy natural gas even at $40 or $30. The rest of the Indian market, say power generation, because we have about 25,000 megawatts of installed capacity, gas-based for power. So that was shut down completely, because a price-sensitive market, no one would buy and generate power at that price. Then per unit cost of generation would go to, say, 20 rupees. No discom would buy power at that price. So that portion got shut. So last year, our total consumption of natural gas went down slightly, though what we had planned was that we would go from a 6.7% of share of natural gas in our primary energy to 15%, but last year we didn't increase. Rather, we went down slightly, mainly because we couldn't buy gas at that price. So, and whatever domestic gas was, another good thing what happened was that the domestic production of natural gas went up tremendously. There was this big discovery in the KG basin, and the production went up by 18 MMS CMD, and it's set to go up by another 10 MMS CMD shortly. So that we were a little bit lucky, and price of domestic gas is more or less controlled because there's an upper limit prescribed, though it's sold by bidding, but there's an upper limit. So because of that, that hit didn't land on the consumer. So as far as this sector is concerned, which means oil and gas, this is the scenario. But we were also hit very badly because international coal price went up, and because there was a little bit of shift in certain cases to grid-based power. So earlier we were growing, the grid power demand was growing only at around 3 to 4%. Last year we've had a growth of 10.5%. So which means that there has been a little bit of a shift also to grid, and also generally after COVID, a lot of industry has come back, and then there is a good growth in the industrial sector, and plus domestic sector has also grown because of the better energy access and large number of villages getting connected. So because of that also there has been growth, and because of that our dependence on thermal has not gone down, though we wanted that percentage should go down with more renewable coming into the grid. But because the total demand has gone up, so demand for thermal has also gone up net. And we have a little bit of a bottleneck in terms of making domestic coal available. So we had to import coal. And there again, the high price hit us very badly. The price of imported coal has also gone up several times. And so some blending of coal took place, and because of that there's been a little bit of an impact on the cost of power also. So this has been the general scenario as far as India is concerned. But good thing is that availability of energy has not been hit at all. So be it petrol, diesel, there were not even a single day when any of our petrol pumps went dry. Even piped natural gas, CNG, all that. So supply has not been affected at all. On power side, grid power also, there have been no power cuts. The consumer price, it did go up in petrol and diesel, but the increase would be less than 10%, and then again came down also. And even the price of power didn't go up. So price and availability we've been able to manage.
But can I ask, that's, the responses in the near term, as in many other parts of the world, are all about, in a sense, managing the effects of volatility on consumers and protecting as best you can. And indeed, in India's case, that seems to have been very successful. We talked a little bit in the presentation about kind of new energy security challenges. I mean, the old traditional ones around fuel supply, they don't disappear, but there are all sorts of new issues emerging in the electricity sector as we move through energy transition. So it would be very good to hear your perspective on, the key risks that you see in the future, and what then the government plans to, how you plan to handle them.
So during this crisis, there have been two major impacts, I would say. One is that almost all over the world, countries have started thinking about energy security in a slightly different manner. And the second impact has been that the price, on the price front, how far one can go to pay for energy. Now that has also become a big question, that because Europe kept buying gas even at $60, which is unbelievable. How can someone start buying and keep buying also? Keep, like, you don't have a choice. You're paying 10 times the price, but still you're buying. So now on the first issue of energy security, the world believed that the world is one large market, and it's a very open market, and demand and supply are all not controlled by someone, or there are no monopolies controlling this. But what came out was that just a 2 or 3% supply decline resulted in price going up several times. So, which means that the volatility is so high. So we could have had a situation where, say, the consumers also cut down demand by 3-4%, and the price wouldn't have gone up at all. But that didn't happen because the suppliers have a group and they can manipulate. Like, I wouldn't use the word manipulate, but then they can control supplies, and then they can ensure that the price remains at a particular level. Consumers are not united in that kind of fashion, so they can't cut down demand. So if the supply goes down by 2%, consumers can also impose some kind of discipline and cut down demand by 2 to 3%, but that doesn't happen. So and then if the demand does go down, the economy slows down or something, then the suppliers are so well organized that they cut down production, and still they ensure that the price remains high only. So and then they can also dictate who they will supply to and who they will not supply to. So for certain markets they will set a higher price, certain markets they'll set a lower price. So which means that countries have to think of the future energy security in a slightly different way. At least your essential energy requirement should be assured. And how can that happen? It can happen only if you have enough production within the country, or you have some long-term supplies where either you have invested money, which means that you own some of those assets, or you have some long-term arrangements or some long-term tie-ups. So what we found was that even long-term arrangements don't work, because we had some long-term arrangements for gas supplies, but the contract says that if the other person doesn't supply, then there will be a penalty of 50% or 30%. So now the supplier is very happy to pay 50% because the price has gone up 10 times. So which means that just those simple contracts where you have long-term arrangements, those also didn't work. That was the kind of situation we landed up in. So which means that we have no other alternative but to look at domestic production going up, or to shift to such sources where we have resources within the country, at least to meet our very essential requirement. So therefore we have to increase our investments on oil and gas exploration within the country. We have to also not give up coal so soon. So we have to look at cleaner uses of coal. We don't want to increase emissions. So we have to go back on carbon capture and maybe even some basic research in that area, and also coal gasification. We have to look at biofuels. We have to look at whatever is available in India. We have to look at a shift from molecule to electron, which means that the grid should take much larger load. Currently, grid is only about 18-19% of the total energy supplied in the country. Grid looks very big, but the total energy supplied by the grid is less than 20%. So IEA said that probably should go to 50% for the world. I think you've given that figure. So we also have to move very fast on that, because it's much easier to put renewable into the grid than to be able to use renewable in the molecule form. So that's where we are thinking now. on how to increase domestic production of energy in whatever resources are available with us.
Can I, because this raises a question which is discussed in many countries around the world as they look at their responses to the crisis, insofar as you're investing in long-term infrastructure for fossil fuels, then of course that comes with a risk. It comes with a risk in terms of the emissions associated with that infrastructure, but also then potentially a commercial risk if the country moves rapidly along a transition pathway, then maybe there is no market left for the energy that's going through that infrastructure. So many people are thinking about, can you future-proof somehow those investments such that they are more compatible with the imperative to address climate change and to acknowledge then that we are going to move through transitions. Now, that's a tricky topic, but I was wondering how that discussion is going in India about making investments in traditional fuels more compatible with a changing dynamic in the energy system.
No, this is again a very important question because we've already set up huge infrastructure in the country, and if we shift or if we transit to other forms of energy, then not only the location of the sources would change, but the type of source would also change. So let's look at our gas infrastructure, which we've partly built, and we are in the process of building it very fast. So we are spending huge amounts of money in laying the pipelines. We've already done, I think, 19,000 kilometers of the main trunk pipeline, and we have to go to something like 35,000 kilometers. So we are not giving up on that. So this is for natural gas, and we also have huge infrastructure for transportation of products, petrol and diesel, and we have refineries. And recently the Prime Minister said that from the current capacity of refining in India, which is at around 300 million tons, we'll go to 450. So which means that we are not giving up on our plans for the infrastructure as far as fossil fuels are concerned. Thermal plants also, we are not putting up too many more thermal plants, but then whatever, I think 25,000 megawatts is under construction and another 25-30,000 under planning or last stage. So that is still going on. So now how do we use this infrastructure in a scenario where the sources of energy change? So on the pipelines, we know that gradually we will start blending compressed biogas into the natural gas, and going forward we may also blend hydrogen. So the pipelines we build should be compressed biogas is not a problem because it's methane, but for hydrogen you do need some changes because of the small size of molecule and slightly different conditions. So some studies we've conducted, we can go to about 3 to 4% by volume in the current pipelines for hydrogen. But if we have to go higher than that, then we'll have to make some modifications in the existing pipelines. But pipelines which we still have to put up, we have to think of modifying so that we can take larger percentages of hydrogen, because future what we see is that same distribution network should get used for the newer energy forms. Otherwise, if you want to replace the entire network, then it's going to be very difficult and the costs are going to be huge. Similarly, we have a fantastic distribution network for LPG. We have 30,000 distributors and 30 crore connections for LPG. So that again is a huge network which already exists. So in the same LPG cylinder, there could be certain things which we could blend. One is DME, but DME, whether we can produce green DME. So that is something which we have to think of, or we have to do research to find some other products which we can blend in that and still use the same network. And as far as electricity is concerned, we have a fantastic transmission network in the country. But here the main shift would be that we would produce a lot of energy in certain states which have a higher resource. For example, Gujarat has a good wind potential as well as solar potential. And similarly, Rajasthan, and similarly, certain other coastal states. And right now, we may be getting a lot of energy from the high coal producing states. So on the transmission network, there would be a little bit of a change, but in the meantime, we might see demand go up on the eastern part of India, and so that same network could be used. Similarly, in thermal plants, we already have a mandate. It's not a mandate yet, but at least some administrative order which may get converted to mandate at any point of time, that thermal plants have to use a certain percentage of biomass. And we produce huge quantities of biomass in the country. So that will not only create a huge market and create green jobs, which even today the Honorable Prime Minister talked about green growth. There's a seminar going on today on that webinar. So there, if we do a little bit of blending, then again, that same infrastructure will get used. Going forward, we could use solar thermal also in our thermal plants, and then again, we could use that same infrastructure with a little bit of modification. So all the future sources of energy we have to keep in mind when we build our infrastructure.
There's one other sort of category of risk that I'd like to come to, and you've mentioned many of the achievements of India, and notably on LPG and electricity access, and of course everyone's aware that deployment of renewables is growing very strongly, and in India, as I think in many other parts of the world, that's now raising questions about the clean energy supply chains, where some of those components are being manufactured. I mentioned in the presentation about the geographical concentration of the critical minerals value chain. So there are the production-linked incentives. There is various exploration activities underway for some of the minerals and metals that would be needed in India. But how do you see those risks playing out? Because is there a trade-off in your view between, in a sense, the cost of the transition and the security of supply of some of those elements? And where do you think that balance needs to be?
So in your presentation, you've very clearly given out some important figures. You've said that 3 countries control some of these critical minerals, large quantities of critical minerals, and without those critical minerals, we can't move forward, because storage would be so important. If we have to get into electric vehicles in a big way, even grid would require storage at some point in time. So, and some countries have monopolies over those critical minerals. Now, for us, it's very important that considering the kind of growth we are going to see in our energy requirement, it's very important for us to secure all these critical elements. And how do we do that? So we are now looking at a bigger exploration program within the country. So far, we have explored only 8% of our area. We've not explored most of our country as far as minerals are concerned. And we have a huge offshore potential also. So on one side, we have to increase our exploration so that we are able to find some of these resources within the country. But we also have to make some collaborations or tie-ups for securing these minerals in countries where they are already explored and they are already available. So we are working on both the fronts, but then all this will take time. So till that time, we are a little bit worried also, because monopolies over some of these critical minerals could be quite dangerous. And in fact, some other countries are also quite concerned, and so there are discussions going on internationally also on how to ensure that the critical mineral supplies don't land up in hands of few countries, and then those, as long as there's an open market, we are not worried, and as long as availability is ensured, we are not worried. But then the fear that those who control these and suddenly they want to play a different game, then it could become quite dangerous. So in the short run, there is a little bit of a problem, there is a little bit of worry, but a few years from now, I think we should be able to secure most of them.
Very privileged position here to be asking all the questions, but this is my last one, and then maybe we can open up to colleagues from another room. But it takes a slightly different tack on, and it's more a question on the sort of governance of transitions, because that's again a topic which is coming up in many different jurisdictions about, because then in many countries they're finding that the national level policies or the goals are clear, and many of the national level policies are also clear, but then implementation in practice depends on a whole host of other levels of administration, and ensuring alignment there is often complicated. And I'm of course aware that you've worked at different levels of administration of government in India. So I wanted to get your perspectives on, you know, there will be a sort of strengthening of state policies in all sorts of areas related to energy security, energy transitions, and how do you think that plays out? What is the way in which there can be the necessary coordination across different bits of government?
So again, a very important issue as far as India is concerned, because we work in a country where states have their role very well defined, democratically elected governments, and center has its own very well defined role. And there are, I would say that the considerations or the subjects on which importance is given or priorities may sometimes be a little different. So distribution of grid power is with the states, and generation is partly with the center and partly with the states. Transmission, again, the interstate is with the center and rest is with the states. And what we've seen is that it's just, I think, 6-7 states who have installed most of the solar and wind in the last few years. So as a country, we've done well, but if we go down to each state, then it's not very uniformly distributed. Some states may not have the need also because they have coal, and some states have hydro, and everyone doesn't need to install solar and wind because their energy needs are being fulfilled. So, but then if we force only few states to do it, then that's also not fair. So there has to be a little bit of a balance. Now, it is important that we carry the states with us, and when we frame our policies, we take into account the requirement or the views from all the stakeholders. And the Power Ministry and MNRE, they do that constantly all the time. They try to bring all the views on the table, and then they frame policies based on that. So very recently, Power Ministry has come up with a trajectory for RPO trajectory they've come up with, and they've got now some mandate for hydro also, but they've given a little bit of flexibility so that hydro states don't have to per force do wind. Solar everyone can do. So those kinds of issues do crop up. There are major problems because distribution companies are financially stressed. They are financially stressed because partly because of inefficiencies, but also partly because there are huge dues. So there are urban local bodies who owe the distribution companies huge amounts of money for water charges or for certain other things, for say street lights. And the discoms in turn owe quite a lot of money to the generation companies because they don't have enough money. So, and they've borrowed heavily also. So large amounts of outstanding money with the banks. So we generally put all the blame on the discoms. We say that discoms are inefficient and discoms owe a huge amount of money. But if you get into details, you find that a lot of others owe a lot of money to the discoms also. And those who owe to the discoms are also some priority sectors where discom can't cut the power supply all of a suddenly. They can't cut the power supply to the water companies because water has to also be given, and what those are also controlled by the state governments. So state governments do have a very major role here in order to balance all this, to ensure that the whole system keeps working. Somehow the system has kept working. Last 15-20 years, there have been times when people have said that discoms are going bust, but it didn't happen. This still surviving in India. Somehow they're managing to supply to the consumers. Their total cost of supply is a little lower than what they realize per unit. So there is a negative gap there. The regulators also have to play a very major role here to ensure that there is no negative gap. So many times tariff policies amendments have been made and attempts have been made to ensure that this message goes through, that you can't have a situation where there is a gap. And if there's a gap, obviously someone will have to pay for it. It has to be paid by the government. Government can raise taxes or do whatever, but then the discoms have to survive in the long run. So these kinds of issues do keep cropping up. And if we have to move towards cleaner forms of energy, then as I said earlier also, that the share of energy coming from the grid has to go up. So which means that the role of discoms has to keep increasing. It's not going to go on the reverse side. So discoms have to be healthier, stronger, and we have to work with the states to ensure that we have enough support for them. And the balance between the central organization, government of India organization, and the state government organizations also has to be maintained. It shouldn't happen that one side there are too many losses and the other side there's too much profit. So government of India keeps watching all this, because it's not that government of India looks only at the government of India organizations. We have to look at the whole system, and we have to ensure that the whole system keeps working. And the Prime Minister has been making very strong statements at times. He's talked about freebies, free things being given, and he very openly talked about all this. As long as even our act says that if you want to give free power or if you want to subsidize, then you can do it, but then you have to pay to the discom upfront. It can't be that the discom gives out the subsidized power and then it gets paid later on and doesn't know whether it will get paid or not. So the act is very clear on this, that it has to be paid upfront. It should come before the actual subsidy is passed on to the consumer. So, so the entire system where we have the center making most of the policies and also controlling the act, and the states having a very well defined area where they operate and having a very major responsibility because distribution is with them. So all have to work together, and so far I think we've done quite well because the system has worked quite well. We can do better. We can certainly do better. We need a little more efficiency at the discom level. We need some more better financial management also. And going forward, we'll have to look at all this.
Questions for Mr. Kapoor?
I mean, I have lots more questions, but I mean, I'm also conscious that we may have questions from our esteemed audience. Yeah.
So the floor is open. Mr. Mirza?
Yes. You have an estimate by 2030. What is the amount of energy storage capacity our country will need if half of our generation is non-carbon? Is there an estimate of how many gigawatt hours of storage?
Now, this is something which keeps getting debated. Now, if you really ask me, we don't need much storage till 2030. Why we don't need much storage till 2030? There are three ways in which you can manage the grid as the renewable penetration keeps going up. So we've talked about 500 gigawatts coming from non-fossil fuels by 2030. In terms of energy, it will be quite substantial, maybe going close to 50%. That's the rough estimate. You also mentioned a figure of 50%. So can the grid take 50% intermittent renewable power without storage? Cost of storage is high. If you do battery storage, a recent tender was done and the cost of storage came to about 10 rupees, more than 10 rupees. So if you're buying solar at say 2.5 rupees plus 10 rupees to 12.5 rupees per unit, which is very expensive. If you do pump storage, then the cost of storage is about 7 rupees. So 7 rupees plus 2.5 rupees, again 9.5 rupees, 9.5, 10 rupees, again very expensive. So and we can do some, we will do some storage, and government will subsidize that. It's already there in the budget also, but that is a very small percentage of our grid requirement. It's only to test the waters, to develop that ecosystem in the country so that manufacturing also comes into India, and we may have the cost of storage go down. Currently, if it is at $250 per kilowatt hour, I think. And if it can, people have done some estimates that it will come down to $150, and at that price, then it becomes a little closer. So we can storage plus the cost of energy. If it is around 7 rupees, then it makes a little bit of sense. So what are the other alternatives before us? The one alternative which currently we are using is to operate our thermal power plants at part load. Also, that's why we don't want to retire our old thermal power plants. While earlier there's a lot of thought that just shut down, but that doesn't make too much sense. Operate them at lower PLF. But we can't go down below say 40 or 50% because then it doesn't work. So the technology is now where if you modify, then you can operate at a lower PLF also. So that's the best solution for us. Second is, some people also have done calculations to show that even if you do excess, supposing you have to supply, say, so you have to set up a solar plant of say 50 megawatts, you set up a plant of 80-90 megawatts and waste some of the solar. Even that is much cheaper than storage. So that's the second solution. You have overcapacity of renewable energy, solar, wind, and you have to do a combination of solar, wind, and hydro. Mainly, these are the three sources, and you have to manage the grid nationally. If you manage the grid, right now we are trying to balance, every discom and every state is trying to balance out. So because of that, it's becoming a little difficult. So if we look at this nationally, so then things would be different. There is an amendment in the Act also. The Electricity Act is under amendment. So there also some provision is being added so that Government of India can play a little bit of a role in creating some capacities which would be nationally available to manage the grid at a national level. So second method is where you manage with renewables only. So renewables to manage the grid and plan in such a manner so that the impact on the grid is not so much. If you just do blindly so much solar and PLF only 20%, and then wind PLF 25%, and then try to put that into the grid, and then again wherever solar is available. If you do that kind of thing, then it's a problem. But if you do a national level planning with a good mixture of all this and maybe waste some of it also, then you can, even with just renewables, you can go up to 50% and you can still have your grid running. There may be some emergencies sometimes where suddenly you find that renewables are down very badly. Those, other than that, you will be able to manage. Third method is that you look at other sources to come in when you want. So gas is one. So we have 25,000 megawatts of gas, but gas is expensive. But then you have to have methods where you are able to. But then we have to shift all the gas capacities for grid balancing. Right now, some of gas capacity has been installed as base load also, which is not correct. So you could have gas, and you could also think of certain other sources which can then come in whenever you need. So or a combination of all this, and then you have to shift your load curve slightly so that it becomes flatter, the peaks become slightly lower. So all this can be done. So it's not that we have to get so much storage into the system. It's not going to work out. Storage is too expensive at the moment.
You mentioned about national level planning. Do we have the legal provisions and the institutional structure to do this national level grid planning?
Yeah, certainly we have. We have on the legal part, if everyone agrees on a voluntary basis, then even today we can do it. But we are creating some legal provision also, and but there are emergency powers with the government of India even under the current act. And as far as the capabilities and capacities are concerned, we do have, because all planning is the responsibility of CA even today. And for grid management, we have earlier it was POSOCO, now the name is changed to Grid Authority of India or something. Grid Controller of India. So we have that organization, and we have the necessary knowledge and understanding.
Renewable power by 2030, which is almost like 50% of the total energy in India. So if I consider that, if it is like 400 gigawatt of renewables by 2030 in the conservative way, so the next 400 will come from the non-renewables way. That is only way of thermal, for example, or fossil fuel power. And we are actually standing on a capacity of 410 total gigawatt of power, out of which the thermal base is like 210. So if I consider that fossil fuel based power from 210 gigawatt to 800 gigawatt by 2030, and we are talking that we are increasing the capacity of fossil fuel based like 10 gigawatt per year. So don't you think disbalance in this equation? And we know that we can able to achieve the renewables by 2030 very well. Number one. Number two, that we know there is a big difference in achieving the capacity of renewable power and connectivity of renewables power to the grid. Renewable powers can be established in a month, in a span of 6 to 8 months, but the connectivity to the grid takes 3-4 years time. So if we calculate, like we are standing on like 200 gigawatt of renewables today, and 600 gigawatt of renewables going to add in the next 7 years of time, do you think that is feasible that 600 gigawatt of capacity in terms of transmission will be added to the grid? So these two questions, if you can add this, thank you.
So first question, you said that we have to do 50% of renewable and 50% of fossil fuel. So if you change this into energy form, then fossil fuel, whatever we currently have, is enough. So in terms of energy, it is enough. Don't have to add megawatts, because fossil fuel PLF is much higher, and therefore nothing to worry on that account. Just that renewable energy capacity increasing takes care of that, whatever target we have set for ourselves. Then on the second part, on the transmission, infrastructure. So on transmission infrastructure, CA has done detailed planning. They have identified areas where renewable is going to come up, and they have a plan to augment the transmission infrastructure. And a transmission has to come before the renewable capacity comes in. It has to rather balance, because we don't want to waste any of the resources. So that plan is there. Sometimes there is a little bit of imbalance, and but like, see, in case of China, they put up huge capacities of wind and solar which never got connected to the grid for years together. So we don't have such a situation. There might be a mismatch of a few months here or there. And then now we are also uh, talking to the various states, and we are telling them that rather we are doing a state-wise plan now. So we are identifying the potential within the state. So we are telling the states that they should exploit their own potential also. Right now, there is a little bit of you can say distortion, because the transmission charges for solar and wind on the interstate systems are zero. So because of that, there is a tendency to buy power from far off, because the transmission charge is zero. So that is not taken into account. So sometimes states are not exploiting their own resource; they're rather buying from far off. So we are working on this state-specific plans, and also looking at the potential within the state, so that then there is a good mix between the domestic or production within the state, and also distributed generation, and the bigger solar parks and big capacities coming in, say, few states like Rajasthan, Gujarat, or some of those states which have huge potential. So if we do that, then automatically the requirement for transmission will go down substantially.
With GAIL India Limited. Sir, my question is that we are having a huge installation of gas-based power plant near about 24 gigawatt, but right now they are underutilized. So are we trying to formulate any policy to allocate subsidized gas for that gas-based power plant? One thing is the clean electricity in case of gas-based power plant. Secondly, gas-based power plant is easy to start in case of national gas grid trip. So are we framing any policy in this way?
So if you're working in GAIL, then you would know that out of the total domestic gas production, we have two categories. One is the APM, which is the administered price mechanism gas, and the other is the rather three categories. Second is again domestic gas, which is the high temperature, high pressure, where there is a upper limit, but it's sold through bidding, and some where production is hardly anything right now, which can be sold at any price, open market. And then there's the imported one. So as far as the APM gas is concerned, which some quantity is going to the power sector even now, but we can't increase that because the APM production is not going up. And the demand on the city gas distribution is going up. The demand in fertilizer is also going up. So that is a bigger priority. So therefore, giving APM gas for power production may not happen. But we have to look for long-term supplies for the power sector, which we are working on. And immediately, I don't see much happening on this, because that Tim would also tell us that the total production in the world is not going to go up substantially in the next 2 to 3 years. So the gas price, if we have to produce gas-based power here in India and also sell it, then we need gas at $7-8. It won't, at the current price, it's not going to work out. So that kind of price level is not possible in the next 2 years. So after that, then it is expected that the gas price would come down and gas would be available. In the meantime, we have to try and tie up maybe some supplies which are slightly maybe long-term contracts. And I've always been telling GAIL and I've always been telling the power sector companies also that let's work on some fixed price contracts, which doesn't happen in this industry internationally. So, and power sector can't take volatility because the power producer has a contract to supply power at a price which is fixed. He can't one day say that I will supply power to you at 3 rupees and second day he says that now it is 30 rupees. It doesn't happen like that in the power sector. But if the price goes down to $2 or $3 for gas, he can still pay $7-8 because he has a fixed rate contract, but he will not pay $13-15. So, and for the producer also, it is good. At least part of his gas he should sell at a fixed price. So he is also better off in the long run. But somehow in this market, no one agrees to this. No one is ready for a fixed rate contract. So we will have to work out some long-term arrangements. Then only it can come through.
There has been, he's talked of purely of the power sector, but Government of India and even without the governmental support, tremendous amount has been done in the other sector, I would say agriculture, where like you have that by use of a certain amount of EV, by some technological infusion, use of drones and all, the carbon, also the type of fertilizer that has been traditionally used now, which reduces carbon footprint to 85% or so. So the total that energy requirement as a whole in other walks of life is coming down, and I believe that energy saving is also, if you consider the demand and supply side, it is also something of a production. But the way I see that in the world over, there is no dearth of resources. Even today, this summit is on sustainability. If we have, I don't know if I'm correct, there is $80 trillion somewhere with the total requirement would be around $5 trillion all over when we try to meet the sustainability target. So the question from Tim would be that the energy requirement is a global requirement. And as what Mr. Tarun Kapoor said, there is a sort of apprehension of it. As long as supply and demand would be controlled in a way that is not desirable and say. So what is the effort like the international organization like IEA and other organizations doing to keep it equitable for distribution? Thank you.
So there's a lot of different elements in that question. Certainly, the starting point for us when we look at the energy system is demand for energy services, for heat, for light, for all sorts of things, mobility, all the things that we need for a modern life, cooling as well. Now, there are policies that can bring that down, and I think the LIFE initiative in India is a very good example of something which also looks at lifestyle choices, behavioral issues, and I think there's an important conversation to be had there. But then we can meet that demand for energy services in a variety of ways, in ways that are more or less efficient, in ways that produce environmental consequences of different types. But it is certainly the case that at the moment there is this very inequitable use of those resources. I mean, some analysis that we came out with yesterday looked at the top 10% of emitters in the world account for 50% of global CO2 emissions. The bottom 10% of emitters in the world account for 0.2% of global emissions. So that's a difference, a factor of 1,000. And that's why it's a very important conversation to be had about the role of energy in development, about ways in which we can create a new, in a sense, low emissions model for advancing. And that's, in our view, we're convinced that India's choices here matter a huge amount. because clearly the path that other countries have trodden in the past was very carbon intensive. Now, fairly or unfairly, we are looking to India to chart a different way. And I think it's incumbent also on countries around the world to extend a helping hand to India as it makes those choices. So we spend an awful lot of time at the International Energy Agency thinking about how we can have useful dialogues with India on some of these issues. That's why I'm very grateful for the chance to listen to Mr. Kapoor today, because the insights it gives us into the way that senior Indian policymakers are thinking about this. And that dialogue that we have, we had the great honor a couple of weeks ago for our executive director to meet with the Honorable Prime Minister in Bengaluru at all levels and with a range of interlocutors on the Indian side. We're delighted at the chance to exchange views and bring our views on sort of best practices from around the world. But I very much recognize your question.
Mr. Tarun Kapoor has to leave now, so we thank him for taking time out from his extremely busy schedule in the PMO to come and participate in this event, and particularly for his responses to the questions from Mr. Tim Gould and from the audience. So let us give him a big hand while we thank you for his question.
Sir, could we have a picture, please?
What picture?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we just understand here.
On behalf of TERI and the WSTS Secretariat, we would like to thank our distinguished speakers for an insightful discussion, and everyone who's here joining us today. To all delegates, refreshments will be served outside the auditorium at the hub, and the Group C thematic tracks will begin simultaneously at 4 p.m. So please proceed to the designated halls. Thank you and have a good day.